Morning. I know everybody can hear me. This mic is just for live stream, but hello and welcome to the Basics of Comic Storytelling with John Lucas. Thank you for coming and thank you to everyone who is watching this online. John is a professional comic book artist and inker who has worked for Marvel and DC Comics as well as some other smaller publishers.
See, now I've got whole paragraphs of this that in your introduction, you're eating away at the time.
I've got like 2 more sentences.
Okay.
Today, using his own published art as an example, John is going to talk about camera angles, panel shapes, and the way to visually tell a story and interpret a story. So after John's presentation, if you would fill out one of these little comment slips and drop it in the basket, we would really appreciate it. That does help us with our programming, and we do appreciate your feedback. So I don't want to take up any of the lecture you have planned, so please join me in welcoming John Lucas.
Hey, as she said, this is about comic book storytelling. So pardon me while I get my bearings. I'm used to just sitting in a cave by myself all day drawing dopey pictures, so I'm not used to really talking to anybody, so certainly not groups of people, so I just want to apologize in advance if this stinks and if I've wasted 2 hours of your day. Like she said, I've worked for Marvel and DC, Dark Horse, Mad Magazine, Image, Dynamite, 2000 AD, Boom, first, all types of, pretty much anybody who's made comics. I'm leaning into this like it's a microphone. Pretty much anybody who's made comics and American comics at one point or another, I've worked for companies that exist and no longer exist. As both a penciler and an inker, I'm guessing maybe you guys know what those terms are, pencil and inker, the division of labor in comics. You give sort of like that. Well, they go back to the studio systems of comics, and people, if you're in manga, you understand the studio systems used to be in the, I'm going to deal mostly with American comics because that's what I know. I don't really know much about manga. The studio systems back in the 30s and 40s, of the early days of studio systems of comics, they had studio systems. What that means is they would have basically just a giant room of people working on comics. And some of the guys who worked in comics, they would get jobs like they were in high school. Like some of them worked as early as like 11 years old. And they would go in and they'd start off, their job would just be erasing panels or erasing pencils afterwards or ruling the panel borders in ink, so that because the guys who were drawing it, they didn't want to have to waste any time doing that. And then as you progress, you would maybe start working on backgrounds and inking backgrounds, and you would work up, and then they would find out later on that, hey, this guy's particular strength is drawing it in pencil. And then because of the printing process at the time, they had to, it had to be shot from inks. It wasn't as sophisticated now, so then they would have someone and make it what they called camera ready, and they would do it in ink. And I've read stories and heard stories where some of the old guys, they would even, if they were under deadline pressure, they used to work twice up back in those days where it was gigantic. And at the drafting table, there would be a guy down here penciling and a guy on the other side of the table upside down inking the thing at the same time when they were really trying to hammer them out. Before we get started, I guess I'd answer some questions I'm asked most frequently. First one, how did I get into comics? Most of you guys, if you have an interest in comics, you want to know how to get into comics. And I'm assuming most of you guys have heard of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Okay, well, back when I was a kid, because I'm an old guy, almost all of the comics made were published by Marvel, DC, Archie, and companies called Dell and Gold Key, and before that there were a ton of them, even more, that weren't around anymore. And they were all, or most of them were located in New York City. Now, I'm from Texas, you guys all being from Arkansas, and the days before um, social media and the internet and all that, you pretty much had to, it seemed like it was a world away. You know, it's like a million miles away, being isolated down in some small town in, you know, Hicksburg. And so it just seemed impossible. And there were a couple of small publishers, like have you guys ever heard of Cerebus the Aardvark? That you have, that was one of the early, like, sort of successful independent publishers. But like I said, pretty much you had, and there were underground comics. You guys familiar with the underground comics from the 60s? People who self-published their comics, but for the most part, you had to live in New York to work in comics, because even then with the mail system, mailing it in was rare because it was unreliable, and you would hear horror stories of entire issues being lost in the mail, and then artists being in the New York area have to jam and draw an entire comic in just like 3 or 4 days. So to avoid all that, you pretty much had to live up there. So to a kid living in Texas, it just seemed like, well, this is impossible. How does this happen? And but then in the 80s, there started to be a few more independent publishers coming out. And then with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, this really kind of like, I mean, and it's considered iconic now. It's a standard, but at the time it was kind of this crappy little black and white comic book that these two guys had printed and published, and it became this huge, huge success. And it was sort of like a punk rock moment for people who made comics. And by what that I mean is in the 70s, when music had gotten really huge and everybody was trying to be this guitar god, that punk rock came out with the Sex Pistols and the Ramones and all of that, and these guys could hardly play their instruments, but it was great, and it was sort of this light bulb moment for people that, oh, I can do that. And so there came it was called the black and white boom of the 80s. And so before that, something that, let's see, this is afraid of, I tend to follow tangents and get lost and then have to backtrack. Before that, again, before social media and all of that, the way that you met other artists living in some little podunk town somewhere is you would go into comic shops and there would be drawings back behind the counter. You rarely see that anymore, but it used to be really commonplace. You'd go in and local kids would draw pictures of, you know, Hulk or Wolverine or barbarians, and the comic shop owners would put it on the backboard, and it was almost like your local bulletin board of all the nerds who like to draw in town. And so you would go in and see stuff and go, ooh, who's that? And the person, you know, which would violate all types of like laws now, would give you the information of the person who drew that thing. And I was one of those kids who drew pictures and gave it to the nice lady who ran the comic shop. And I met guys that way. And so we started doing our comics and or trying to do comics. And then we started doing comic conventions. And we would travel, and then we would meet these other guys who were making their own comics. And can I get a glass of water? I feel like I've got dry mouth. Oh, okay, awesome. Yeah. I'm starting to get dry mouth. I'm going to look like a mad dog in a minute. And so we would start traveling and meet other guys in other cities. I feel like Marco Rubio. Guys making their own comics, and we would start doing things in each other's comics, and sort of networking and making friends. And and apart from just building relationships that eventually, you know, it's important to have relationships. Why did I tell you that? But it was practice. It was great practice, because the more you draw, there's an old saying that you have like 5,000 bad drawings in you, and the only way you can get them out is get better is to get all those bad drawings out. So as we were making more and more comics pages and putting them in each other's comic books, eventually just the practice and the exposure and the relationships that you get, we started working for independent publishers. And there used to be, again, in the 80s and 90s, there was a publisher called Caliber. They're not around anymore. But a lot of the guys in my age group did work for Caliber. Have you guys heard of Madman? Is that a comic anybody knows anymore? Okay, well, that was a big indie comic in the 90s. But guys like me and Phil Hester, who works and does tons of comics now, a guy named Mike Lark, and Guy Davis, who works on Hellboy comics and does stuff for movies. We worked for this publisher called Caliber, and DC Comics and Vertigo. There used to be an imprint at DC called Vertigo that did sort of, air quotes, more adult themed comics, and they used to use Caliber as almost a farm team. And you guys familiar with baseball and the farm systems, where the developmental leagues, kind of like a farm system. And again, eventually through the relationships that I made through them, and going to bigger and bigger conventions, and finally eventually went to San Diego Comic-Con. One of the buddies that I met through working at Caliber and going to local conventions, he started working at DC Comics. Well, he introduced to me at a San Diego Comic-Con. My wife calling me, telling me she got where she was going. That I met the art director at the time. He was the art director at DC Comics for years, Mark Chiarillo, and through him, I wound up getting introduced to writers and artists, and eventually got my first work at called Starman. And yeah, from that point on, I started getting a little bit of work here and there as a penciler. Again, you know, the division of labor. A little lost. This is what I was afraid of. Started getting work through DC again, just as a penciler, and they wouldn't let me pencil my work at first. So I got work, and I would do fill-ins, and I would get, which is, you guys know what a fill-in is? Fill-ins and small arcs, and just sort of like pickup stuff. I was kind of like a guy off of the bench on a basketball team. But eventually my work started drying up. And something that's, and so with my portfolio, I went and met Mark, and he introduced me to a guy named James Robinson, who was a big deal writer at the time. Yeah. So I don't know if you guys have noticed, but even some of the biggest name artists will sort of fall out of favor, and you don't see them anymore. Like they'll be like the biggest artist in the world, and they just, either they can't meet deadlines or just taste change. You see different styles become popular in comics all the time. And eventually I stopped getting work. So, and to be honest, I mean, I probably got work before I was ready to. I wasn't really good enough. But finally, after a while, I got a chance to finally ink myself. And I was doing backups for like a book in Detective, a book called Detective that Batman is in. They were running backups at the time. And the editor that I had, the first few batches of artwork that I brought in that had inks on it, he started commenting on how much he liked my inks. And he said, you could give like a tutorial on inks. And I said, well, get me some work as an inker. And he said, well, you're a penciler. And I said, well, if I'm not getting work as a penciler, then I'm not a penciler. And something that's kind of important that I think is having a reality check on your ego. it's not only, I think it's important not only just to, it's important to improve. That was one of the great things about working with, and working on those other books with other creators, was not only what is the practice and the relationships that you built, but you're around these different artists that were doing things differently than you and oftentimes better than you are. And if you allow a lot of, it's a defense mechanism, your ego, in a lot of ways, because if say someone's looking at your artwork and they point at something and they say, oh, this isn't very good, especially, I'm not going to speak for all of you, but I can speak for myself. I mean, I grew up a bit of a nerd, and so you're self-conscious to start with, and you're drawing these things to sort of escape reality and live in a world that you kind of would prefer to be in anyway. So when someone points at something that and says they don't like this, your defense mechanism and your ego may, instead of having you look at it realistically and go, oh, well, gosh, yeah, I could be better at this, you may react and pull back. One of the great things about being with that group of artists is being in those rooms and looking at each other's artwork in a friendly environment with people like you. You can be inspired by them and learn lessons from them, because you're able to let your defensives down and not let your ego sort of rule you. And so how that relates to what I was babbling about earlier is when I was presented with, because I wasn't getting much work as a penciler, not keeping my ego out of it, I was able to go, okay, well, I'm not getting work as a penciler. What do I need to do to keep getting work in this field that I want to work in, was to sort of take a step back and see the opportunity of becoming an inker and sort of shifting gears. And so through the relationships that you build with all those people, I knew other pencilers who liked my inks, and they were able to recommend me for jobs. And it was really a great opportunity, because as an inker, I wound up working on people who were better than me, or at least different than me. And the way that I always approached inking was, there are some inkers, and not to knock them, but if you put an artist in front of them, they're going to ink everybody the same way because they have their own style. And I didn't look at it that way. And maybe because I was a penciler who had been inked by people who, and I wasn't happy with it because they did their thing without really considering what my intentions were. I, again, put my ego in my back pocket, and I would contact those pencilers and ask them who their influences were and what they were going for. And if they had examples of inks that they were happy with, I would ask them to send them to me. And I would try to emulate that, try to get as close to that as possible. And I had friends who, and I'll still ink occasionally, and I have friends who hate the fact that I ink because they want to see me draw. And I mean, to be honest, I would rather draw too. But it was a really great learning experience because I didn't look at it as, well, I'm just going to do what I do and tough. I was forced to draw or ink in ways that never would have occurred to me, because I think we all tend to sort of find our comfort zone and stick within that. Like if perspective is hard, like drawing all the buildings and the cars and all of that, and drawing it in perspective, and a lot of us, when we're younger, especially if you don't like to draw something, you just don't draw that thing. Well, if you never draw that thing, then you never learn how to draw that thing. And so you're limited in what you can draw. And so in the you have to push yourself out of your comfort zone. And as an inker, and my approach with inking, just by the nature of the way I approached it, it constantly pushed me out of my comfort zone. And I was able to learn from, not just from seeing people, working over people's work that was better than mine, but again, by pushing me out of that comfort zone, I had to learn inking techniques that probably I never would have occurred to me to even try. It forced me to try them. So now that I know how to do those things, I can bring it back to my own artwork, and it just makes me better. And now that I can have both of those skills, if I fall on hard times, I've been like for the last, gosh, nearly decade, I've just been drawing my own stuff and rarely inking anybody. But I know that if I fall on hard times as an artist, I can always fall back on inking and do that. Boy, am I doing okay? Is this too awful for you? Okay. Thank you, thank you. Like I said, I sit in my room all the time. I'm not used to talking to people and trying to sound like I know what I'm talking about. What's that? Okay. So how any of this can relate to you. You can still self-publish, but like when my buddies and I were self-publishing, there used to be a thing called print minimums. We would have to go to find a printer, first of all, that could do offset printing and put the book together in sort of it's called a saddle stitch. And there were minimum printings of 3,000 copies. And I got to tell you, you're not going to sell 3,000 copies unless you're really, really lucky. And that winds up being a lot of boxes of comics in your house. The last book that my friends and I published was a book called Punk Miscellaneous Debris, and we had to print 3,000, and I think we sold 200. And so when I was in my 20s, I would move from house to house, and I had to carry this giant box of comics with me everywhere I went. And eventually I wound up moving out of a house, and I just left them all in a closet. So the person who moved in next got this giant closet full of bird cage lining, or hopefully they were a better person than me and took it and got it all recycled. But now with, and you guys are probably going to know things more than I do because again, I'm an old guy, but you don't even need to self-publish anymore. You can put your work on Webtoons, or you can go through Kickstarter or Indiegogo or Zoop, the funding crowdfunding platforms, or you can just put your stuff on. There are people who are way smarter than me who just do Instagram and put their comics on that, and there are places like Webtoons you can put on, or even if you do want to keep printing it, there are places like indiecomics.com and Kablam that are like digital platforms that, and I don't mean to be a commercial for anybody, but you can put them on there and they'll print them one at a time and mail them to people. So a lot of that has been that burden has been taken away from you. All you have to really invest in it is your time. And if you're doing this stuff anyway, then you're doing this stuff anyway, so you're not adding anything you wouldn't willingly do anyway. The tough part about all that is if you're publishing, because of the distribution system, you have sort of like a built-in audience that you're trying to read. It's finite, but you know the system and you can work in it. With what you're doing now is you have the entire world to try to appeal to. And while on one hand, holy cow, you have the whole world you can sell your comics, but you also have an entire world of other people who are trying to gain the attention of them. And so it comes with its plus and minuses. But Um, so it makes it difficult to reach. Let's see. But that's the thing is, though, you don't need the entire world. If you can just find a small slice of it, then that's all you really need. Unless you want to live like a king, then you can just find that little slice and make a living. Second question is, I'll go ahead and pass this stuff out. I handed out some things, or made some things that part of it. Sure, if you want to take a sec, that'd be awesome. Oh, pulled some apart. There's half. Thank you. There's, here. Thank yours. There you go. Everybody have something? There you go. You want one? Absolutely. There you go. So the second question is, what do scripts look like? You now have one right there in your hands. They all follow the same basic template. Some writers are more detailed, some are less. Some writers will tell you at the top of the page how many panels are on the page, which is something that I really prefer because it gives you a sense of how much space you're dealing with on the page going into it. Often, or anytime I get a script that doesn't have that on there, I'll always go back and add it just so that as I'm reading it, like again, you get that sense of the space that you're dealing with. Another question I get is, what's the difference between digital and analog? And as I said, I may have said earlier, I'm a Luddite, so I have no idea other than how it affects me. So the only way that it really does affect me is when I would ink. I almost never ink over pencils anymore. The artist will send me a digital file, I'll convert it to blue, and then I'll ink over that. And the other way is I never have to mail anything anymore. I can just scan it, clean it up, adjust the levels, and send it off. But as an artist, it shouldn't really have much in effect as long as you can produce the work of a certain quality. Can I take a break here and go to the restroom real quick? You guys, okay. Thank you. Okay. Well, I'm going to get to some of it, and that will hopefully be the useful part of what I'm talking about. Yeah, the what little I do know about digital is it seems to be like a huge time saver. The guys that I know that do use it, I'm kind of envious of them. The process that I use to create comics is very involved and very tedious, and comics are kind of tedious anyway. Where I have my steps where I do my layouts and then I have to transfer them over, blow them up, and then ink them. And sometimes the changes that I want to make are just maybe making things a little bit bigger or moving them around. And with digital, it's all in there. You can do all the process on, or probably a lot of you guys do work digitally. No? Y'all draw on paper? Wow, that's crazy. I've so many of the guys that I know that are even my age and younger have all switched to digital. So I'm shocked because how much you can do it just on iPads and iPhones now. But by doing it digitally, you just do it all in that one place. And if you can just isolate something and move it, if I try to do that, I have to start over on another piece of paper. Another thing I get asked is, what about photo reference? And how much do you use it and when? And I use it as much as I need to and as little as I have to. But I'm not always the best judge of where those lines are drawn. I should be more open to it, but I'm either stubborn or lazy, or probably a combination of the two. Though when I was younger, I used to hold sort of the dumb opinion that you shouldn't use reference, but it's nonsense, because as you're, like we were talking earlier about having to draw buildings and cars and all of that, in order to know how to use it. To draw it, you need to know what it looks like. And now with iPhones and the internet, you can look up reference for everything. I'm going to keep going back to the fact that I'm an old man now, but when I was older, I would have, you call it a morgue, or you used to call it a morgue, which is just files and files of photographs that you thought, oh, this is a photograph that I might be able to use someday. And God, it was a pain, and because it was such a pain, often I would just try to fake it anyway. But it's surprising how many young artists, and even artists my age who are old enough to know better, who still hold this nonsensical idea that you shouldn't use photo reference. And the great artists, not just in comics, but illustration, fine art, before photographs, they would just have models come in. So don't be afraid or be stubborn and try to resist using reference, because it's just an important tool. Don't be lazy and dumb like me. Another question you get asked a lot is, how much influence does the writer or editor have on your work? It kind of depends on the writer or editor. I've been lucky to never really work with super controlling editors. But I've heard horror stories about editors who want to control even the tiniest details. Every field is going to have a boss that wants to put their fingerprints on something, just to sort of feel like they have to justify their job. But the best bosses in comics or otherwise are people who give you what you need and then either leave you alone or encourage you. I've had some editors that are essentially traffic cops, making things sure that things get where they're supposed to go when they're supposed to be there, and don't really involve themselves otherwise. And I've had several jobs where the editors made really great suggestions, or I had one editor once. He and I actually got to be really good friends, where he gave me the script and he gave me photo reference for this particular car with a Post-it note on it saying, "Draw them in this car or you're fired." And he was just joking around, but just keeping it light, because comics are unless you work in a studio with a bunch of guys, and I'm sorry I keep using the word guys, and it's a non-gendered guys, uh, it's a very solitary life. And even within that, because these guys are in the other room, but you're still your head down and you're working in this world. So having an editor that helps you in enjoying your job can be a really great thing. You get to be friends with them, and you're going to respond better. And for the most part, with writers I've worked with, have been pretty easygoing and are happy to take suggestions on a better way to show something. Just understanding that they're visual thinkers, but cartoonists are. That's all we are, is visual thinkers, I guess. But I've had a couple of experiences where they've been very resistant to any type of suggestion. It just really runs the gamut, depending on who they are. Do you have any other questions about comics or the experiences? Was that too boring? You bored yet? No? Yeah? Yeah?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not like, you have a lot of good information here, but there's like an adjacent question.
Yes.
What character is your favorite to draw?
Probably Golden Age Captain Marvel, Shazam, the guy with the little boy says Shazam, and then he turns into, just because I like, if you give me my preference, I'm going to draw light, silly, fun stuff. I mean, that's not to say that I don't like darker, more serious stuff, but I got into comics through reading Mad Magazine and Cracked Magazine, so there's always a part of me that sort of is drawn back to light and silly. If I'm at a convention and somebody asks me, tells me to draw whatever I want, you're either going to get a Golden Age Captain Marvel doing something silly with the words written, world's mightiest, whatever, competitive eater, or Howard the Duck or Man-Thing, because again, they're cartoony and they're grotesques, and it's just more fun. I couldn't care less about drawing superheroes, really, because it's just a man or a woman in skin-tight clothes hopping around punching something, and that's not particularly interesting. There are only so many gargoyles you can draw Batman perched atop before you just get sick of drawing Batman. That's not to say that if anyone at DC Comics is listening and they thought that I would make a good Batman artist, I would happily draw some issues of Batman. Anything else? Anything else? Yeah.
I have a question, and I'm pretty naive on this topic, so any
Well, I'm as dumb as a stump, so we're in trouble.
would be interesting. It was very telling. I really liked what you said about how you were a penciler, and then when you moved to inking, and what made you different, what made people like you, why people sought you out, was because you did research, you'd ask them, right?
Mhm.
So you went above and beyond, and really talked to the people, the pencilers, and said, like, who are your inspirations? I want to make sure I mimic that. I bring that to the inking process. So just the little knowledge I have on penciling, they obviously mark like where you're going to fill in with ink and different
Yeah.
things like that. So how did you, I guess, like, how would you make that different? How did you make inking different or specific for those pencilers?
Well, there are different, I guess, just different techniques.
Like different medium even, I guess, or different like pens and things you'd use?
Well, different pens. I tend to ink everything with a brush because that's just what I was originally shown, and I like the look of a lot of artists that use that. But whenever you're just basically line quality, line weight, how you spot the blacks, like one of the techniques that I learned or had to teach myself sort of on the fly was, it was called dry, it's just referred to as dry brush. And it's not a clean, sharp line. It's, your brush isn't dry because it still has ink in it, but it's not completely loaded either. And typically whenever I'm making lines with that, they're quicker because the brush is on the surface of the paper. You know, you don't want it sitting there with the ink coming out of it. Yeah, and just sort of figuring out the quality and the line. There are people who, you know, their artwork is, my artwork tends to be sort of round, but there are people whose work is more angular. And that it's probably typically going to show a little in the pencils that that's what they're looking for, but I might not know to what extent. I mean, one of the questions that I would ask editors or artists, do you want it clean or do you want it dirty? And that's basically asking them how, you know, what the quality of line that they want on it. Yeah, I guess I can't be more specific than that without showing you. That's the problem with asking a cartoonist to give a talk, is we get dry-mouthed and stammered and lose our place, where if a writer could probably, you know, write you a whole story on it, I would have to show you some examples. But yeah, just, and you know, different artists, are you an artist or are you a cartoonist? I mean, you know, you can look at one artist and one of different completely styles and look at them and see the differences in them, not just in the way they construct things, but in how they render them. And, you know, I would just try to emulate that. So, anyone else? No? Yes? No? No more questions? Okay, so on to actually discussing storytelling. Like I said before, or I meant to say before, this is about visual storytelling, or if you're feeling sort of self-aggrandizing, sequential art. It's not about drawing skill, it's more about the nuts and bolts of telling a story using images, how to present static visual information in a way that, that affects time and emotional response in the service of telling a clear story. A pretty basic way to do that is to just move the camera around and the size and shapes of the panels, but you shouldn't do it, just do it without forethought or reasoning. Camera angles and the cropping of these angles can have effect on the reader, consciously or otherwise, how they absorb the information. Yeah, just to be clear on this too, I'm going to tell you about some of the things that I think about that are important in telling stories, and I'm not telling you that this is the only way to do it. This is just one of the ways that I think about doing it. I recently, the book that I've had been working on for a while until recently, a book of my own, I wrote and drew most of it, but in each issue there's a little short story that I wrote, and I had guest artists come in and do these little short stories in it. And one of the guys that I tapped to do it is a young artist who I met and I really liked his artwork. I asked him to do it, and then when I got the story in, and due to a lot of situations that I won't go into that were out of mine and his control, the storytelling just wasn't great on it. And so I had a discussion with him, and I wound up going in and breaking down the story and how I would have told it. But while in the descriptions and why I was doing it, I was telling him, you know, you don't have to do it this way. It's just, I want to show you the way I'm thinking about it. And that way to just spark him thinking about it beyond, oh, this is a cool image. Because with drawing and writing, a lot of times you'll have an idea for something that's very cool, or you think is very cool, but once you get deeper into writing the story and drawing the story, that bit of dialogue or the scene that you think of, or just the visuals that you think of, you find that, well, now that this idea has been developed past a certain point, it doesn't even fit anymore, so you wind up having to scrap it. Certainly there's a place in writing and story for moments and visuals that are, oh, this is cool, this is dynamic, I'm going to grab the person's attention with this. It should never come at the expense of effectively telling the story and choosing the best shot to provide information to the reader. So it's just important that you think, like, not I'm doing this, but why am I doing this? This is the best way to impart this information, both just on an information level and on an emotional or psychological level. One of the examples talking about, like, and you can use color for it too. I don't know how many of you work in color, but you know, you can use color to affect things. I love old comics. I mean, yeah, I keep referring to myself as old and all that, but I like comics that are like even way older than me, that like my dad or my grandparents might have bought off of the stands. And one of the things that I like about it, and I think they're so energetic, is because of the limitation of the form. They didn't have great printing or great colors, just because they didn't have access to it, and they were producing this stuff cheap. It was disposable. So the immediacy of the coloring sometimes it was done in a way that with coloring now, with being able to do computer colors and color it as though, you know, it was in real life, people would never really even think to do that anymore. And I think it's kind of a shame, because that kind of stuff works. Like, one of the things I could think of just right off the top of my head is the old monster comics of the 50s. It isn't uncommon to see a panel of a guy, of the hero of the story. Once they see the monster, they would show you know, a picture of his face, and it's just tight cropped on him. This is kind of a boring angle, but you put the tight crop panel on him to sort of, he's feeling uncomfortable and stressed. And if I had drawn this better, I would do it even a little bit more of an angle, so that his world has been thrown into a tilt, to throw the shadows on him, the extreme shadows on him, just to, again, make it look creepier. But then in the colors they would go through, they would make all of this background a solid red, because red is a scary, intense color, and then color him yellow, because yellow is the color of fear. So just in that one simple little image where you're just showing this guy, there are all these different things that you can do to show that he's scared because there's a monster on the other side of the camera. Here's a, what was I doing here? Okay, another example, like just changing the camera around to create stress. Say you've got somebody on a ledge. You can draw somebody. Here's a building. Put a little pigeon on the, there's a window. The window down there, so you know he's not on the first floor. Somebody standing on the ledge. I'm not going to give you a real great drawing because that would take forever. Standing on it. Sure, you give the message there, but it's a boring, can you see that? No, you can't. Okay, it's just a boring drawing of a person standing on a ledge. It's a very soap opera angle, meaning it's just straight on. But if you wanted to make it more tense, for one, make the panel taller. You can play around with the shapes. Play with that extreme angle. Put a little more English on the character. And just the tilt of that angle and upward, the tilt of the camera to make the building, it's so tall that it's falling over almost to look at it. It also upsets the character because he's in the camera on. It's the ground is no longer flat. It's at a tilt. And just creates more of the air of this guy's falling by making the panel look like it's falling itself. Let's see here. You can also do things to make characters seem more imposing, changing the camera angle around. Like again, you can have a big guy meeting a little guy, and that gets the information across. But works even better. You have this guy so big. He's practically out of the panel. He's literally out of the panel. He's so big. You're at a camera angle where you're looking down on him like that. And here's your guy here, scared out of his wits because this guy is gigantic. Or you can even, he's a big imposing figure. You can silhouette him, and because the color black sort of has the connotations of nighttime, it's scary. If you put him all in shadow, he becomes this shadow figure, and he's more imposing and scary, looming over this guy. Or you could even switch it from the other way around. Here's your hero. And again, this guy's so big, he's practically, here, you can do it from the ground. How about that? Again, put the ground at a tilt. Here's this guy up here. Makes him seem even more imposing. Here on this one, you even have his shadow going over him. It's like a dang building or a tree casting a shadow on top of this guy. You even shadow him, cover everything except for his scared eyes. Just so that you draw the focus on the eyes, showing you that he's terrified. So, and what I sort of, another thing you can do I sort of hinted at it earlier, and if someone is frightened or under stress, you can actually squeeze them with the panel with a really tight cropped image. It's like the walls of the panel are actually squeezing in on him, making him uncomfortable. And like I said earlier, he's at a tilt like he's been shown. He's completely off. You do that with figures too. Suddenly he seems more off balance and frightened just because the camera angle has changed. Let's see. And the use of lighting and color also. You guys watch any old Warner Brothers cartoons? You ever seen the one where, gosh, Elmer Fudd has been frightened by someone, or Bugs Bunny has been frightened by someone? Again, it's just like that panel that I did earlier. You pull from an odd angle. You cast extreme shadows. Warner Brothers cartoons are great for that type of direction. Yeah, squeeze in even tighter. Tilt that panel that way. See, if I was working digitally, I could have just pinched it and pulled it. There. You can also use it to, like you guys understand or know what like establishing shots and things like that are? An establishing shot. An establishing shot is just what it is. It's to establish the setting or the atmosphere. And you can, again, use, oh, the shape of the panel and the camera shot that you use to go to give the impression of it. I'm gonna, like, say you've got a guy set in he's alone in the desert. I'm gonna use the desert instead of a city because I don't want to draw a city. But yeah, you could draw, here's a guy, he's standing in the desert, in the dunes. Or make a nice Lawrence of Arabia shot here. There are all the dunes. I mean, it's just stuff as simple as that suddenly he becomes much more alone. In this way, you put him up on the left side of the page, he's looking at it, this expanse, he's looking at the endless vista, or Pubinoe here this way, using left to right. This is how much he still has to go. You know, just in the placement of where he is. Another way that you can use panels to create a sense of time is, you guys have watched movies that have a lot of action and it's quick cuts. To let you know that you can do that with comic panels too. Frank Miller was a guy, you guys know who Frank Miller is? He did a comic book in the 80s, Daredevil, and sort of revolutionized it and did Dark Knight and all of that. And that stuff had been done before, but he really popularized it and sort of made it a bigger part of storytelling. Is you can use a series of very small panels all in a row that work just like those quick cuts in a fight. There's a hand with a knife, a hand with a gun or whatever, firing, and just use those quick little panels like that to give the impression of fast-moving motion. And here's an example that I worked out that I've got this thing, so I don't even have to draw it now. How you can use camera angles to, this is pretty small, I'll go ahead and redraw it again. Again, using left to right and using shadows and where figures are in placement. Here you've got a scenario, you can basically tell the exact same street light, or very similar layouts, but just by changing a couple of the angles, sort of change the impression that the reader has. Yeah, I'm going to draw a little bit of city here you've got over on the left, and in the extreme background, you've got a figure underneath a street lamp. And in the foreground, you've got this guy, or this shadow, don't know if it's a guy or a gal, in a silhouette. Because they're larger, they seem more imposing. There we go. Here the figure has noticed them. Streaming, you're wondering what this lack of sound and this little clicking is. That's my pencil. Let's see. So what we've got here, going from left to right, because we all read left to right, right? We've got the person who, in the spotlight, the first person you see. Moving to the right, you see this figure on the far right who's in shadow, and he's larger than that person, so he's creating more of an imposing figure. Person notices it. We've got the still person on the right in the shadow. This person the person in the thing reaches into their purse. So I shot, bam. We've already established because this person is a threat. We could switch the angle where the person in the thing here, setting up a different dynamic. Got this person lurking in the shadows, but they're smaller, so they're less imposing. So they're creepy, but not necessarily a threat. Put the exact same panels there, and because we've established earlier on that this person isn't a threat, like this one here, we can change the action using the exact same panels here. This person's bringing them something. So you see how I set it up differently, like just from the very beginning, setting up the different sort of power dynamic. You guys bored? No? You're lovely, lovely liars, and I thank you for that. So that's just one example. Let's go to the scripts and the artwork, I guess. And I figured if I could show you through my own work sort of what I was doing when I was thinking, that might be easier for me to sort of show you what I was talking about. And you guys have the artwork for the comic book story in front of you? Is that in all of your stuff? Okay, so you can go through like page 1 of panel 1. That was what I was talking about earlier, an establishing shot. It's setting a figure, let's see. There we go. Page 1, panel 1, establishing shot. Pretty much boilerplate, basic stuff. It's setting the scene. That's what an establishing shot does that I talked about earlier. Providing info that gives a feel for the setting, local color, a mixture of architectural types. It's a melting pot. It's like a port town, kind of like on Mos Eisley. Isn't that what it was on Star Wars? Almost called it Star Trek. Giving it the local color, and I did that by, again, like different architectural types and like a wide variety of people. And there's a boxing poster in the foreground with our hero and a name that shows up later. So I'm setting up future events. That's something as a storyteller you should always try to do. If something is important at the end of a story, you need to show it at least somewhere early on. Otherwise, it just seems like you've sprung it on the reader and it'll feel contrived. For example, if at the end of a story, it's discovered the murderer stashed the jewels they stole in a vase somewhere that they mean to come back later. At some point early in the story, you need to show a room where the vase is. And the reader, needs to see the vase. It doesn't need to be front and center, but it needs to be seen. Again, so that when it shows up later on, it's like, oh, this is a story element. You need to establish all those earlier on. Doing something else in there with reference to background characters. Just the oversimplification, or not oversimplification, the simplification of the character's features. Well, there's a good amount of rendering in the environment and the main figure, though exaggerated or drawn fairly naturalistically. The little guy in the background eating the bowl is a broad caricature. I mean, there are people who probably be offended by the caricature, and I wouldn't blame them. The reason he's so simple, cartoony, is for the purpose of the story. He's unimportant. He's just local color. If I was to flesh him out too much, the detail would be too specific, and he'd lose instantaneous recognition. The character is simplified to the point that it's almost just like a mask. And that's something that in drawing too, the Japanese use it a whole lot. Like in manga, like a lot of the characters, they look a lot the same, but they have like different haircuts, because that's like the identifying feature. But a lot of the faces are very simple and the expressions are very broad, and that's because the less detail in it is, like I said, it becomes less specific. Like as our brains look for patterns, so again, it's trying to get too specific in this face shape. I mean, we look at this and we automatically know that that's a face. But the more detail that we add, it becomes more specific and less universal. So we're able to relate to it less. So that's sometimes referred to as masking. Other ways to mask are in silhouette. And again, just to simplify things so that people recognize the basic shapes. And yeah, background characters, a lot of times, they should be more simplified and less identifiable, I guess, unless they're an important one. Then again, you know, if they pop up later on, that you need to be able to recognize them. There are other ways to establish a setting. A common approach in manga would have been to focus on several of the different elements in individual panels before moving in to meet the main actors. The Japanese are way more interested in mood and capturing small moments than Westerners are. They'll stretch out time and enjoy it just for the sake of enjoying the moment. Reflecting on them and to give you a feel. Westerners, not so much. You know, we want action, so we tend to rely on more just like that big bang sort of establishing shot, like I did. Again, you'll see it's moving left to right out of the panel and into the flashback. There are a lot of different approaches to storytelling. Some people can be pretty rigid. I know people, artists and editors, who hate breaking panels and overlapping panels, unorthodox layouts. I'm not one of them. You need to be careful that they don't distract from what you're trying to show, though. But I'm of the opinion that there's a time and place for anything. Just be aware of how it affects the overall clarity. It's like, you have to create a baseline. It's like I was talking with a guy the other day. He was asking me about my storytelling, and that typically when I'm giving information, I try to keep my panels fairly simple, just like, 1, 2, 3, 4, just squares, because the information that I'm presenting is important. But I'll break panels and use different, like odd panel layouts. Just like when the example that I gave earlier in tilting the camera angle when I want a specific effect. If I'm just trying to create just a natural, simple atmosphere, create sort of like a baseline, I'll keep it pretty simple and throw out the crazy stuff when I want the reader to feel like, okay, everything has kind of gone off the rails. That way it has impact. You guys have probably been to the grocery store and seen like a parent who's yelling at their kid constantly, and the kid is just numb to it because the parent is yelling all the time. The yelling doesn't mean anything anymore. So yeah, if you're using crazy layouts all the time, then when it comes time to use it, it no longer has any impact. It's like yelling at your kids all the time. And again, the same thing, if we're using, I just said that. If you're using crazy, it's no longer unusual, so it no longer has any impact. Same thing goes for color. I'm going to be a grouchy old man again. I'm not a fan of a lot of modern coloring with all the pinks and purples and aquamarines and all of that. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't use those colors ever. I just think that when they're used constantly on everything, they lose their impact. If normal is everyone and everything is pink and purple and aquamarine, then what do you do when things become abnormal? As an aside on this this page, there's the pelican in the background. I missed an opportunity with it that I've kicked myself for ever since, and I'll point it out to you a little on down the road. On page 2, we meet a couple of new characters with a scene involving multiple characters. You need to be aware of blocking, which you guys know what blocking is. It's a theater term. It's basically where the characters stand within a scene and how they move around each other or within that scene. And how they exist in the environment. The reason for this is, a couple of reasons for this is visual continuity. It gives the reader a more convincing sense of reality. You can see where everyone is in the room. We're for the most part stationary here. If we were randomly changing positions, it would like being, again, in like a fever dream or something. It would be unusual. I know this seems like duh information, but you'd be shocked by how many portfolios I see where there's no consistency in where characters are placed. This especially happens in fight scenes. I'll regularly get a portfolio where Batman is punching someone and they say he's flipped someone over his shoulder. Well, suddenly you see this character again and he's in front of him. Or, you know, they're just not thinking about where these characters are in the space, and so it seems jarring as a reader and you're not really getting the information correctly. And again, it just comes to a lack of thinking. Like I was saying earlier, I don't necessarily want you to think, I'm not trying to want you to think about storytelling like I do, just to think and be aware of what you're doing and the important information that's going on. Another reason for paying attention to where everybody is in the room is word balloon placement. Not only do you need to leave room for the word balloons within the panels, but you need to think about what order they fall in, and how the people in the position of the room are, so that throughout the course of the scene there's space for them and they fall in the right order because you need to attribute them to particular individuals. You know what I'm saying? And that means planning out the entire scene, like figuring out where people are at the beginning, because throughout it and all the way to the end, you're moving the cameras around to give the information and have a visual impact, but also keeping track of where everybody is so that, you know, you don't have people, because we read left from right, you can cheat it sometimes, but the person who speaks first should probably be on the left side of the panel. The person who speaks second should be on the right side of the panel. Can I take another bathroom break real quick? I'm sorry. everybody doing okay? You about to pull your face off because you're so bored? No? Okay. Am I giving you some information? Is this making sense or helping a little bit? Okay. Sorry I stammered so much and got dry throat earlier. I just, again, I'm used to sitting in a room by myself for days on end and not talking to anybody, so this is a very, very strange experience for me. Okay, so we're on page 2. In panel 2, we're about to have the backstory dropped on us. And so what I did there was I pulled back, and again, going back to the masking by making very simplified characters and silhouettes in different panels. I mean, it would be difficult to draw them with much detail, as small as they are, but it also served the purpose to not try. You know who they are because I established them in the story earlier. So I just boiled them down to their most basic details so that they're recognizable, their shapes. You already know who they are. Again, the Japanese do this quite a bit. So do actually the Europeans. There's some great European cartoonists you guys should check out if you don't know them. Mobius, of course, Philippe Drouillet, Tardy is fantastic. They've been printing a lot of his stuff in English again recently. When the information is being presented in the story is of greater importance, an American guy, P. Craig Russell, is another one who does that beautifully. Then the important is more information than who the characters are. Yeah, you boil them down to that, and then whenever you need to reestablish the reality of the story, you can choose a moment that's appropriate and blow it out on the detail and make it look more realistic if you want. Again, in panel 3, there's silhouetting. Again, dropping those characters into the background because the information is more important. In panels 4 and 5, another way of setting the mood and establishing the relationships of the people you're reading about is by the actions of the characters. It wasn't in the script, I don't think. Maybe it is. It's been a long time since I looked at it. But the guy's pet monkey I used to create sort of like a little story within the story and establishing the relationship of this guy's pet monkey with the other guys that he's friends with stealing his hat. And it's just adding sort of like a character color to them in, you know, again, this monkey is the pet of the main guy, and the main guy is such the main guy that the monkey feels fine with stealing the guy's hat and just torturing them. Let's see. On the next page, I pull in tight, emphasizing the reaction to the information given by the last panel. Cropped, like I said earlier, cropped tight to give the impression of discomfort. If the information was truly disturbing, tilt, jar them, put them off balance, like I was saying earlier. Not completely happy with how the roof of the gambling den meets with the panel above. It's not a tangent per se, which you guys know what a tangent is? Okay, so it's like, try my best to do it real quickly here. Say this person standing right here, they're standing next to a wall. The wall is right there. It's when lines come together in a drawing so that, and this is my idiot's way of explaining it, it's like whenever a line comes in, or two lines from two separate things come in and they connect in such a way that it becomes confusing to the eye and kills the depth and all that. You shook your head knowing what a tangent was. Was that a decent enough description? So that's something you need to watch out on whenever you're drawing stuff, is just to make sure that you don't have any tangents. If I was got that, and again, it's a simplified drawing, but move it over that way so that the wall and the person are overlapping to create the sense of death, then you know that those are two objects that aren't, running into each other. So yeah, it's what is this? Says, yeah, it's not a tangent per se, but it creates a sort of a visual oddness. I wish I would have moved it a little bit more. But that's a heck of a punch, isn't it? It blasted away the panel border. And again, that's when, like I was saying, when I've given all of the information on the other ones using the simplification, the masking, and the silhouettes. And so I use this opportunity to create even more impact by breaking the panel borders. So again, setting that baseline and then breaking it. Let's see. I mean, it would have worked with the border, but in this instance, I don't think it harps anything that way. Again, some people hate this kind of thing. They would have hated it had I had the character flying out of the window, but who cares? And the flashback of the crime lord, who we discover has it out for the hero, is in the foreground and therefore larger, and more imposing. Like I was saying showing you earlier on, how you can use the panel placement and the angles to make a person more imposing. And the last panel, our man of action leaves the spotlight. Information dump. Information dump just being a term for whenever you dump a whole lot of information. So having him, once he's leaving that scene, he's actually leaving the spotlight of the scene being, putting a spotlight on background information. I actually had him leading the spotlight, so I'm pretty clever, right? Next page, here's where I blew it with the pelican. I intended to have it land on the roof of the gambling den when it came back. When it flew off earlier, I thought that would have created a nice bit of visual continuity, but I forgot and I didn't do it. And I drew this story years ago, and I've kicked myself ever since that I forgot to draw the pelican. Because that would have been a cool, like the monkey with the hat, just tying everything together and, just creating a bit of story character. It wouldn't have furthered the story any better, but it would have been fun. Let's see. I think so anyway. I think any kind of flavor you can give the art that doesn't detract from the story enriches the world that these characters are living in. In doing that, you're creating a world the reader can more deeply buy into, and that perhaps helps the story. Just be sure to not let it get in the story's way. Now, as far as the actual telling of the story, I probably should have tilted the camera angle on the first panel a bit to, again, create discomfort as they grow smaller and weaker, walking into the building that jets out at a severe angle into the sky with a slight tilt of the world's axis would have ratcheted up the unease a little bit more where they're walking into the den. In panel 2, I'd wished I'd raised our hero a bit more to make him larger. Now, as much as I hate to make excuses, I struggled a bit with this page. The story itself could have used an extra page for the reveal of the fighter with an ape head, but we had the page count we had, and that's a limitation you have to deal with sometimes. We just couldn't figure out a better way to do it. So this page gets scrunched a little bit, and a story beat isn't served as well as it could be. You guys know what a story beat is? Okay. Best I can, I'll explain it to you. Beats in a story, if you strip it down to just actions, and by actions I don't mean just physical, it can be a revelation or discovery or a realization that drives the story. Those are the moments of impact, change, and reveal that move the story along. Those are the beats. And since we're dealing with a static visual form, there are visual beats. Even within a scene, with the ebb and flow of a conversation or actions, there can be mini beats or arcs, like a conversational arc, where like things are, someone gets the upper hand, or the tide of a conversation shifts on someone getting the upper hand. Those can be little like scene beats even. And because in the Western world we read left to right, I feel all beats should begin on the left and end on the right. Whether it begins at the top left-hand panel border of the page or ends at the bottom right-hand panel border of the page, or it's a mini arc within a scene in the middle of a page, it should start on the left and end on the right. Just so that there's a sense of order and rhythm to it. I mean, there are times when you can break that, or sometimes you'll have to break that because of, again, space limitations. In this case, the new beat is the reveal of the monster. And it's great. I still got to end on the right side of the page, but a reveal is sort of a different kind of beat, especially one like this, that if you have the space for it, it's always great to, you're left with the mystery, sort of like a cliffhanger at the bottom of a page, and then that reveal that happens, you turn the page, and it's literally revealed by you lifting the page off of it and seeing it. Unfortunately, because due to the length of the story, we weren't able to do it. Let's see. Like going back, when are the heroes revealed? First panel on page 2. When should the Frankenstein box with the gorilla head be revealed on the next page? In a perfect world, the crime boss turns to introduce that. Let's see. There's a lot of camera movement as we descend into the chaos until that panel. Like I said, the world tilts on its axis to show just how hard he was hit. Again, we probably should have put the shot of Mike, Sailor Mike, the character getting floored, to the next, well, maybe not. But that would have meant squeeze one more into that last 2 pages. I'm torn over it, but at the same time, it seemed like the right choice to make considering space. On the next page, here's another mistake by me. The hero should have been on the right side of the panel. Because, like I said earlier, we read left to right. Since you're revealing the things, in the story, there are all those boxers that have limbs missing that the gorilla-headed fighter is made up of. That's the story was as Sailor Mike in the Patchwork Palooka, which is the script that you have. The information that we're revealing is what's important in this story, and then his reaction to it. Rhythmically, we should have seen the information of those fighters first, and then him. And it's also just the way, again, where I had established the blocking. He got knocked over to that side of the page, and so he was there. But I messed up on that one. And again, the last panel again should be flipped left to right. On the next page, move to that, they've figured something out. The key to the story, the Frankenboxer, is now small. The rest of the way, I wish I could go back in time and tweak little things to improve the art, but it works well enough. But those are the major things that I wish that I could change. And hopefully it's helpful. The reason why I chose my thing to show you what I thought did and didn't work in the story and why I made certain choices was, one, it's just an example to do it, but the other is I hope it helps in showing that I've been doing this for 25, 30 years now, and everything that I do, I wish I could go back and change something, at least something about it. And so as someone like you who's young and just getting into this and figuring it out, you shouldn't beat yourself up about mistakes that you catch later. That's just part of the process. And again, going back to the whole ego thing, it's important to have confidence in doing this because, I mean, this is supposed to be fun. And confidence is sort of like a byproduct of getting better, and then that confidence leads you to getting better. But it's important to remember that, or not to beat yourself up about it, I guess. Because if a guy that who's been doing it for 3 decades, longer than a lot of you have been alive, if every project that I've ever done, I look back and I hate it for a little while and want to change things about it, then you shouldn't. You should be able to look at yourself and not, like I said, not beat yourself out of it, but look at it as you've gotten good enough now that this thing that you did before, you see the problems with it. So that's a sign of improvement, of getting better and getting smarter. And like when I would learn things that I was inking, I could take that back to my artwork. Your increased awareness and ability to see the problems in your past work, those are lessons that you take to the next one. And it's a sign that you're getting better. So I think I'm done. Did it last long enough? Is it too short? How long did I go? Okay. Okay. Well, there are extra things that I put in there too that should help you. I can see you right there looking at it. One of the things that I put in there for you to help you is Disney comics in the 50s. Whenever they would get a new artist working for them, they would hand them that to help. And there's probably way more useful information in those little 4 to 6 pages that I gave you than you got from sitting here listening to me drone on for an hour or so. And there's another thing in there called Wally Wood, 22 panels that always work. Wally Wood was a guy who worked in comics from the 40s all the way into the early 80s when he died, and he's widely considered by comic artists one of the all-time greats. And it's just a collection of 22 shots that, again, they're good touchstones, basically. If you're at a place where you don't know quite what to do, you can look at that, and it could at least trigger some ideas on how to what choice to make. So, does anybody else have any other questions? No? You just ready to get up and get out of here? You want to ask? Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
That's the first graphic I ever saw with no words.
Uh-huh.
And that thing haunts me. Like, I think about it all the time.
Yeah.
Like in the middle of the night.
I'm not familiar with that, and I'll have to look for that. I have seen comics that don't use any words. And there's another, speaking of Wally Wood, he did a strip for Mad Magazine years ago that the only words in it are sound effects. And yeah. What is his name? He does a character called Jim Woodring is an artist who's fantastic. He has a character called Frank that's a cartoon cat that walks through all these surrealistic, and all of his stuff is wordless. Well, it can be for particular stories. And in order to be effective, it has to be told very, very clearly, because you're not relying on descriptions or dialogue to help move you through it. So again, it requires very clear, concise storytelling. And I mean, and that's really like the most important thing that I probably didn't do the best job of getting across to you. I mean, I said earlier, yeah, I don't want you to think about making comics like me. I just want you to think when you're making comics, and think about what you're trying to get across. Something that happens with young writers, I bashed on young artists a little bit, or bash on young writers a little bit, is a trap that a lot of them run into, and I did when I started writing stuff, is these ideas live in your head, so you understand them in and out. You understand everything about them. And so when you're putting down the information, there can be an assumption on your part that the reader understands it, but the reader doesn't live in your head. So you've got to give them all the information that they need. And it has to be clear. And in a silent comic, you really have to be clear about everything. Like the shots that you use, and again, the feeling that you're trying to elicit from a particular shot. You don't have someone going gasp, choke, because they're frightened. You have to express that visually. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I wish I had the answer to get faster, because as I'm getting older, I always thought as I got older I would get faster, but the opposite is true. And I talked to other artists that are guys that came up with me, and they complain about the same thing. I always thought, oh gosh, I'll get smarter, and I'll know what I'm doing, and I'll get faster and faster. But I've been getting smarter, but I have never been smart enough to see the answers to the problems beforehand. I always see them afterwards. And a couple of things, well, many things happen as you get older. You lose the energy to bother with a lot of stuff, but the things that you do bother with, you become very particular about. And so the thing that I'm concerned with is comics, so I care deeply about it, and that has made me very, very particular about it. So not being smart enough to see the solutions first, I wind up redrawing things over and over and over, or just sitting here looking at it, thinking about it, trying to figure out what it is, and being very particular and conscious of what I'm putting down. So when I was your age, I was as fast as I ever got. In my 20s, I could draw a couple of pages a day. And I hope no editors are listening to this, because now I'm lucky if I get 2 or 3 pages done a week. But as far as like sketching, just like meaningless stuff like this, or not meaningless, I'm trying to give you some information, but this isn't a finished drawing by any stretch of the imagination. You just have to keep doing it. Like what I said earlier about the 5,000 bad drawings that you have in you, you just have to get them out. You just have to get them out. You have to draw, and you will. You'll reach a point where you accrue enough information that it's in there that you don't have to struggle. And if you need reference, use reference. Just draw constantly. If you don't know something, don't be afraid to use reference for it, or look at other artists and see how they would do it. And don't swipe their work for your own work, but if there's an artist that you really, really like, and I'm sure you all do it to a certain extent, or have done it to a certain extent, copy their artwork to see how they do it. When I was inking, it helped my drawing, because I was going over a guy that I inked who was, oh my God, he's an amazing artist, Isad Ribic. He's fantastic, and just tracing over his figures and seeing how he built them, and how the lines cross, and how he created form by going over them, it helped tremendously. So yeah, just draw constantly. draw things that you don't even really have any interest in drawing, because at some point in the story you might have to learn how to draw it, and the more you learn trees, the easier drawing trees will be. Draw folds in clothing. If you have a friend that will sit there long enough for you to draw them, draw them. This has been years, but I used to do a convention in Conway. I don't think they even do the convention anymore. But this guy would bring me his drawings all the time, and he would draw guys on motorcycles wearing leather jackets with pretty women on the back. But it was obvious he didn't look at pictures of a motorcycle. He didn't look at pictures of guys. He didn't look at pictures of leather jackets. And he was married to an attractive woman. He could have gotten her to pose. But he didn't, and she was standing there when he was doing it, and I was just like, here, and she was wearing a leather jacket, and I was like, you've drawn this guy in a leather jacket, but it's obvious to me you weren't looking at a leather jacket or haven't paid to it. I said, look at the folds in her arms on the jacket. Study that type of stuff. I mean, when you're out somewhere, I lived in New York City for years, and when I would ride on the subway, I would just watch people, and I would look at the different types of faces. I would look at the way their clothes hung on them, and how the folds in the fabric moved around their forms, and how you don't necessarily have to draw it all the time. Just be aware of it. If you see someone and the shadow hits them a certain way and you think that's a cool way, don't stare like you're a creeper or anything, but be aware of it and look at it and try to think, I'm going to use that later. Because as an artist, you're constantly trying to build sort of a catalog of images in here. And since all of it, whether you're drawing stuff that happens in a fantasy world or outer space, or even if you're drawing very cutesy little manga style stuff, these characters in the world that they're based on, they're still wearing clothes that are made out of fabric. They still have, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, and a face. You're simplifying those things. And the only way to know how to simplify those things is to know what those things look like. Like I draw sort of cartoonier people, but I still have to know kind of how a person is put together, their construction, and where their arms build, and how the shapes of their arms change, because the muscle groups, when you do that, and that it changes the shape of your arm, and how that muscle comes down through here, and that one comes here, and that one there, and then around here, and then those muscles there, and if you raise your pinky, that muscle appears. You have to know, at least have a basic understanding of how this stuff works in order to consistently create even like a very simplified little figure moving throughout a world from all these different angles. The same goes for, like I said, fabric and clothing, the way bark on a tree looks. If you're drawing an alien cartoony tree, you still want to know, well, how and what direction, how do the branches grow from the main trunk, and then those tiny little, how do they reach up, and how do the leaves fall off of that? You're going to simplify it, but you should still have an understanding. You can't simplify something that you don't know. You have to have the foundation underneath it. So just draw constantly and look at real things. I don't know. Did I ramble too much? No. Anyone else? No? Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it wasn't too painful. Thank you for for suffering through the point where my throat started getting choked up and I got nervous and freaked out. Being patient with me. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it and learned some stuff. Well, I just have a cheap little mechanical pencil that I bought. You can buy them pretty much anywhere. I also have, I didn't bring it, but I used to use and still occasionally use, it's called a lead holder, and it's an old style. It's made of metal, it has a nice heft to it, and you push the button on and these claws come out, and you slip the lead into it and it holds it. It's an old school drafting pencil, and I have to erase it, sharpen it I have a sharpener that I put it in there and do it like that. And I used to use that exclusively, but the point wears down because it's a much thicker piece of lead. So what I use that for now is if I'm struggling to get something the way that I want it. I don't like drawing small, I like drawing big, so drawing on comics pages, it's very small, I feel very constrained, so I work everything out on another piece of paper. I do most all of my planning and my thinking on pieces of paper like this with, years ago when I got the comics companies, when everybody worked on paper, Marvel and DC printed their own Bristol board with Marvel or DC Comics on top, and if you got on a book, they would say, what kind of paper do you like? And you'd say smooth or a rough finish or vellum, and they would send you a giant stack of paper with Marvel or DC Comics on it. And so at one point I scanned some of the DC board and altered it to wipe the DC off of it, and I'll print that small so that I have the dimensions of the page. And I do my layouts loose, not much looser than what I'm doing here, and then I'll go and I'll tighten that up, and then I'll take that, and after other stages that are more the reason why I'm so slow, I'll do all of my thinking, my planning there, and then I blow that up to the actual board and light box it. I have a box that's just what it is, a box with light in it that I can put a piece of paper on and trace. I'll trace those images onto the paper and tighten it up. So if I'm struggling on something on this, I'll go to my sketchbook, because my sketchbook, it takes me out of this space and it doesn't have this sort of sense of permanence that does. And then if I'm struggling with this, I'll put this down and I'll grab the lead holder because it has that big chunky piece of lead in it that I'm not worried about details, I'm just trying to get shapes. Because a common problem that artists will have, because we joke about it, all of us do it from time to time, is you start laying something out, and before you even have the figure laid out, you'll start drawing the face in great detail. And you're focusing on the wrong thing first. You need to get all that structure down, and then you put the detail all over it. And so that big, giant, chunky lead removed from the page onto the sketchbook with this giant lead, all I'm thinking about is shapes and forms, and I'll use that. Or if I'm trying to get some really tiny details on a page, and this is still a little bit too thick, I'll take that pencil and I'll sharpen it super, super, super sharp so I can get like whisper thin lines on the thing. And then as far as pens, I mostly use a brush. But whenever I do use a pen, there's a pen called a Micron. And that's just a brand, though. They also, Rotwang makes a version of it, and other people make versions of it. And those are just for, like if I'm inking buildings, thing that needs rulers and straight lines, I'll use those. And then because of animal cruelty, red sable is becoming harder and harder to get because you have to kill the sable to get the fur. So it's harder and harder to get brushes with red sable, which is what I've always used. I've been experimenting with different pens, and I recently learned about a pen from Jet Pens puts it out. There's pens that I like. I don't know the name of it, but the Japanese make incredible pens and brushes. God, what is the name? Kuretake is one. They make. They call them brush pens, but it's really just a marker with a really nice flexible nib on it, but with like a finer point on it. And I'll use those if I go to conventions and do drawings. I'll do it in pencil, and I'll hit lines with the little micron that's thin, and then I'll thicken it up and spot the blacks with what did I do? Kuretake brush pen. So, and then they actually make, I believe Kuretake makes them. It's called the brush pen, and it is actually like a brush where it's synthetic fibers, but it's several of, whereas the one that I was talking about before is more of a sponge tip. They make them where it's actual individual fibers that come together like a brush. And I've played around with a couple of those, and I don't like them as much as a brush, but they're about as close to using an actual brush as you can. The problem with it being is that when you're inking with a brush using ink, it dries pretty quickly, and the ink that they use in the brush pens stays wet a little bit longer. And being left-handed, I'm constantly putting my hand in it, and I have to go back in and white out. And because the ink is different, you try to white out it, it bleeds through the whiteout. So you have to put layer and layer and layer of whiteout over it. So he just clutched his breast like that was a horrifying. Yeah. Oh, okay. I thought you were clutching your breast in horror over the idea of having to white out. Yeah. So, yeah. Anything else? Anybody got anything? Yeah? It is. I brought some of my artwork for you guys to look at. I didn't bring much. I've got a bad back. He's talking about being an old man again. I sit over desk. So I hurt my back the other day, so I didn't bring very much of it. But I did bring some from, if you guys want to come up and look at it. These are pages from a book that I did for Todd McFarlane called The Haunt. And then there are some pages from a graphic novel that I worked on called After Houdini that came out a couple of years ago, and maybe I can convince the library to carry some. But if you see these pages and you like them, the comic shop in Fayetteville has copies of its 2 graphic novels in that series. The first one is After Houdini, and the second one is called Before Houdini, of course. And he's got some copies of those there. So, but you don't have to. You don't have to buy anything. But it's Rock Bottom, yeah, Rock Bottom. I know he said he came to the had a signing there when they came out, and he bought them. So I know he's aware of them. So, yeah. So any other questions or? Okay, we're good. Well, if you want to come and look at artwork, if you have artwork of your own and you want, oh, I don't deserve that. If any of you brought your own artwork, I'm happy to look at it and talk with you about it, or give you whatever advice or pointers. No, okay.